Welcome to New Paradigm Podcast. Welcome to New Paradigm Podcast, and now this is going to be a discussion about the cross-race effect, and this is going to be sort of a mini podcast. It's kind of a follow-up or an addendum to just what was just a brief section of a previous podcast. And in my previous podcast, I just touched a little bit on what's called the cross-race effect, and it's sort of a general umbrella term that's used to apply to this. It's used to describe this phenomenon in which people seem to have an easier time identifying and remembering the faces of others from their own racial group, and likewise they have a more difficult time identifying people from other racial groups. And there's quite a bit of research that's been done on this topic pertaining to adults and also to young children. And now when I say young children, this research is being done on children as young as 3 months old. I mean, so these are practically newborns that are exhibiting this cross-race effect phenomenon. And so I wanted to just take a few minutes to really dig into this topic, because I know that if people look into the references that I cited, or if people just know about this topic, they're going to notice that I came to some different conclusions than a lot of the researchers, at least some of the researchers themselves, have come to. And for that reason, I just wanted to examine this topic in depth and really explain how it was that I came to the conclusions that I did. Now, this cross-race effect, it goes by many names in the literature. Sometimes it just goes by the cross-race effect, sometimes other race effect, same race effect, kind of depending on what the researchers are getting at in their particular study. And now when you look into the research that's been done on young children on this topic, you'll notice that written right into the abstracts of these studies is how prominent this phenomenon is. So you'll read things like, it's widely accepted that 3-month-olds have a propensity to want to look longer at the faces of people from their own group, and it's been well established. And so the point being that the existence of this phenomenon is not disputed. That's accepted. And so what the researchers are really trying to ferret out in a lot of these studies is whether or not this phenomenon is genetic in origin and it's just something that's inborn, or is this somehow a product of culture, of socialization, and of the environment, in which case it could probably be easily corrected for. At least that is, I would assume that would be their hope. And so in quite a few of these studies, what they do is they'll run image tests. So what they'll do is they'll take in a group of children they'll begin at 3 months old, they sit them down individually, they show them images on a screen, images of faces of people who are the same race as the child and maybe one other race. And they'll flip through them and they'll gauge how long does that child stare at each face. And predictably, most children stare longer at the faces of people from their own racial group. And so to try to determine whether or not this is genetic or whether it's cultural, what some of the researchers have done is they will try to prime the children, and they'll show them pictures of people from that other racial group. They'll get them exposed, acclimated to seeing people of this race. They'll prime them to at least just be looking at faces from this race, and then they'll retest. And then what they find is that, well, now it looks like this cross-race bias has been eliminated or greatly reduced, and now the children are looking at both races equally long or close to. And what they infer from this finding is that clearly this wasn't a genetic propensity, because all we had to do was give these children a little bit of exposure to people from that other racial group, and then it eliminated the bias. So therefore, this is just a cultural problem. And the conclusion that some of the researchers come to in their write-ups and the way they try to rationalize all of this is that they say, well, okay, so here's what we think is happening. It's that the children, these are young children, so they're born. These are monoracial children, so they have two parents who are the same race. The extended family who's maybe coming over to the home to see the new baby, they're all probably the same race. The friends coming in are probably the same race. And so the child just hasn't been exposed to people of other races, and therefore, when we bring them in and we do this test, the child's just confused, and all we had to do is give them a little bit of exposure to that other racial group, and we can fix the problem. Okay, so right off the bat, I am not convinced, I am not persuaded by this interpretation because I I'm really skeptical that a child could, in the United States could be that racially isolated. And now, bear in mind that a lot of these studies are being conducted in the United States. And you have to imagine these are newborn children. They are being brought in and out of the doctor's office, the hospital. They're in the hospital and then they're back in the doctor's office. They're being brought in for follow-up appointments, immunizations, things like that. They might get sick. They're being brought into the pharmacy. Well, anyone who has been to a hospital or a doctor's office in the United States recently will be well aware of the fact that, I mean, these are highly multiracial, multicultural institutions. A doctor's office is not a business that's catering to one specific demographic in society. You walk in and you see people from literally every demographic, every walk of life in the surrounding area. So just based on that alone, that child is getting some exposure to people from different races. And in addition to that, when the child is at home, if the parents are watching television, if they're watching movies, even if the child is placed anywhere within proximity of a phone, of a tablet, something that's playing videos on YouTube with videos with people in them and commercials, just through all of this, the child is getting some exposure to people of different races. It's unavoidable. And now you might be thinking, well, yeah, but those are images on a screen. That's not real, true exposure to people. But the way these tests are conducted, they're just showing these children images on a screen. And so for the child to sit down and to see faces of a person from whichever race on a tablet computer, that's very similar to the testing environment and very similar to what that child is seeing in the testing environment. And then also, in these tests that are done on children, when the researchers are trying to kind of prime the children and acclimate them to seeing people of another race, again, they're just showing them images. They're not bringing in crowds of white people and black people and having them all, hold the baby and shake hands with it. They're not doing that. They're just showing them images. So again, I come back to, if that child just saw images at home, on television, on a newspaper, a magazine, anything, that child was getting a lot of that same exposure that they believe is priming the child. So bearing all that in mind, the child must have had quite a bit of exposure to people from different races before coming into the test, and they still showed this cross-race effect. And so that's why I'm skeptical. I do believe that the researchers were able to reduce it. They temporarily reduced the bias, but I don't believe that the fact that the bias was there was because the children were so isolated. And I also don't believe that the priming in itself really had any effect. I think that it was somehow tipping the children off to be thinking about faces of whichever racial group they're being shown. But I don't believe that it was actually truly reducing this cross-race effect. Now, why, you might ask? The thing that makes me the most skeptical of that is the research that's conducted on adults. Now, when you look into the research that's done on adults, again, just like the research that's done on young children, it begins with all of the same statements and concerns written right into the abstracts of the studies, saying things like it's widely accepted that this cross-race effect exists. And now you have to think, what is the likelihood that the group of adults who participated in some of these cross-race effect studies, what's the likelihood that these American adults had very little exposure to people of other races? And that includes exposure through television, through movies, through magazines, the internet, everything. I think it's safe to assume that 100% of the adults who walked into the tests had massive exposure to people from all sorts of different races. Now, remember that when these studies are conducted on young children, quite a few of the researchers say that, well, the cause of this effect is a lack of exposure to people of different racial groups. And in one study that I read, they even boasted about how even brief exposure through images and pictures, brief exposure to people of different races will reduce or eliminate the cross-race problem. Well, now, if that's true, why did all of the adult participants walk in and show the same cross-race bias? Now, there was one adult study that I found particularly amusing. It was, I believe it was a joint study conducted between the University of Ohio and Florida. And now these are both highly multiracial states. And again, you have to think that every adult walking in to participate in this study had had massive exposure to people of different races. So what they found when they did this study is they brought in two groups. The first group, they came in, sat down at computers, and they looked at a series of images of people's faces, people of different races. And the researchers told them, okay, you're going to look at a series of faces. Some of the faces will be duplicates. And so when you see a duplicate, press the button. And they went through, and predictably, people had a more difficult time identifying the faces of people from other races. Now, the researchers brought in a second group. Now, this was their experimental group. And what they did is they kind of forewarned them about the cross-race effect. They gave them a whole preamble about it. And then they asked this group to make a concerted effort to not do that, to not fall victim to the cross-race effect bias, and try really hard to identify all the people of all the racial groups. And so this second group, they sat down at the computers, they went through the test, looking at all the images, and to the surprise of the researchers, the second group did very well. They had closed the cross-race bias gap almost completely. Then the conclusion that the researchers drew from this was that, now this is strong proof that the cross-race effect isn't even genetic in origin, because if it was, these people wouldn't have been able to compensate for it and to close the gap and to compensate for the effect. If it was genetic, they couldn't override it. This to me seems like an absurd interpretation of the data, and I think we can completely dismantle this with a simple thought experiment. Now, just imagine a hypothetical guy. Now, this guy is really obnoxious. He is in your face. He is loud. He is boisterous. This guy is like Kathy Griffin on amphetamines. Now imagine this obnoxious, boisterous guy walking into a job interview, the job of his dreams. Now imagine him sitting through that job interview. Do you think this boisterous guy could keep that personality under wraps long enough to survive through the job interview? Yes, I think that he could. Okay, I'd like you to imagine one more hypothetical guy. Now this guy, he's got a really short fuse. He is quick to anger. He's just a ticking time bomb. This guy is out of control. Now imagine this guy sitting somewhere on a first date. Do you think he could keep that personality type under wraps long enough to make it through that date successfully? And again, yes, I think that he could. I think he could conceal it even longer than that. But with both of these hypothetical guys, over time, little by little, these personality traits which are being suppressed will come out, and the true personality will eventually emerge. And I think something similar to this is going on in these cross-race effect studies, in which when the researchers do certain types of priming and when they make the participants hyper-aware of the cross-race effect, they get them thinking about it, concentrating on it, trying to intentionally not do it, or in the case of children, just showing them lots of images and getting, it's difficult to know exactly what a 3-month-old is thinking, but somehow they're showing them lots of images and getting them focusing on this other race. Under those circumstances, yeah, I think that they can create an artificial environment which reduces this cross-race effect bias But the reason it keeps coming back and it keeps resurfacing, the adults who had had all sorts of exposure to people of different races walk into the study, and lo and behold, that exposure didn't do anything. The cross-race effect has returned. The reason it keeps coming back is because despite all of the priming, despite all of the high hopes, eventually people return back to whatever their original programming or their original hardwiring and genetic programming is. And that includes something that looks like the cross-race effect. One final thought on this, and that is that a lot of this research is being conducted in universities by university professors, university staff, and it's no secret that the vast majority of university professors, and even within the field of psychology, are of a particular political persuasion, and that is left-wing, left-of-center, progressive. And so it should come as no surprise that when a group of these professors conduct one of these studies and then it comes time to write up all of their findings and to try to put forth some kind of proposal and try to make sense of everything they've discovered, it shouldn't be surprising that they would be overly eager to reach for an environmental explanation and kind of a feel-good, environmental, easy answer. And that's why I think we should take a lot of these conclusions with a big grain of salt. There was a fascinating anecdote from the psychologist John Haidt, in which he was giving a lecture at some kind of a conference of psychologists, and he said there were about 1,000 people in attendance, and he was trying to illustrate a point, and he said, well, let's do an experiment. I'd like to see a show of hands, and can I see everybody raise your hand if you consider yourself politically, ideologically left of center? 80 to 90% of the hands shot up. Then when he got around to saying, okay, well, now let's see a show of hands. Raise your hand if you consider yourself conservative. 3 people raised their hands. And this just illustrates the point of why a lot of these conclusions really need to be taken with a grain of salt. And when we're talking about who considers themselves to be left-wing, who considers themselves to be right-wing, progressive, conservative, these are not just opinions on what people feel the tax rate should be. These are spheres of thought that really have their own genetic component to them, and they have all kinds of implications on how people view problem solving, how they would interpret things, and people's underlying worldview. And among people who consider themselves to be left-wing or progressive is really a unanimous opposition to the possibility of genetic differences between groups. And that has to be kept in mind when you're reading these people's interpretations of their own data. Ultimately, there are 2 points worth taking away from all of this. Now, the first being that just because a behavior can be controlled, can be reduced, just because some kind of a behavioral phenomenon can be affected under strict conditions and after priming, just because that can be affected is not proof that it didn't have a genetic origin. And I think the thought experiment about the obnoxious guy and the guy who's quick to anger, that alone should really put that idea to bed. The second thing worth taking away from this is that all of these environmental explanations that have been offered to explain the cross-race effect theory really fail to hold any water. Ultimately, they're all just variations on a theme, and they're all trying to make the argument in one way or another that either the children or the adults who went in to participate in the study just simply hadn't had enough exposure to people of different races. And, of course, this is an absurdity. And so the cross-race effect exists. It's almost certainly a product of our biology. Like most other animals, we have evolved to be more in tune to others of our own type, of our own tribe. And this seems to be the reality, regardless of how uncomfortable it might make some people.